today we are going to start with the Torah. The Torah is the Jewish name for the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Okay? And so we're going to take a look at these. And as I said last week, this class will never be an in-depth exploration of one book. Right? So we're going to hit the highlights. And so there will be things that I skip. There will be things that we don't talk about in very much detail, simply because we could do a whole class on the book of Genesis. To get into that deep, nitty-gritty detail takes time. So we're going to look at the overarching story and try to piece together an understanding of Genesis. So let's start with that first book of the Bible, Genesis. The nitty-gritty facts. Author, we don't know. Jewish tradition says that Moses wrote the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Modern biblical scholars have said, no, probably not. But based on our archives and the records we have of these books, they're written and separated over several hundred, if not 1,000 years. So Moses could not have written all of these together. Okay? So we don't know who the author of Genesis is. That's okay. We don't really need to know the author to understand that it is a God-breathed book that tells the story of creation of the earliest people and God's relationship with them. The dates indicate that Genesis was written about 4,000 years ago. 2000 BC is when we believe that Genesis was written. And remember last week I said that the dates can change, because this is based off of our archival record, what we found of the original text. So tomorrow morning you could wake up and the headline of every newspaper could be that they found an older copy of Genesis and now they think that it was written in 2300 BC. Okay? And that's fine. It doesn't really matter when it was written, as long as we understand that it's God-breathed word that tells the story of creation and God's relationship with early humans. Okay. The book is split into 2 parts. It's separated into chapters 1 through 11 and chapters 12 through 50. 1 through 11 tells what we call the primeval history, not specifically about any people that we can identify as having literally existed, but this is the story of creation. This is the story of Adam and Eve. This is the story of things before written word and history and law existed. 12 through 50 focuses in on people, and it's the ancestral history of the Jewish tradition, of the Christian tradition. And it's where we get introduced to some of the more famous characters of the Bible and start to hear this very beginning relationship between humanity and God. And so we're going to start by going through Genesis. Okay? And if you have your Bibles with you, I'd encourage you to open those up, and you can see I've got mine dog-eared all over the place as we're going to hop around a little bit tonight. And so open first to that very first chunk of the Bible, Genesis 1. Very rarely do we get started at the very, very beginning. But let's read, just briefly, these words from Genesis 1. Quick note, I'm reading from a CEV Bible. I know many of you have purchased CEV Bibles, but if what I'm reading does not perfectly line up with your translation, that's okay. You can either choose to tune me out and read what you have written, or to not read along but to listen if it's hard for you to kind of concentrate on 2 conflicting narratives. But here's the word. When God began to create the heavens and the earth was without shape or form. It was dark over the deep sea, and God's wind swept over the waters. God said, "Let there be light," and so light appeared. God saw how good the light was. God separated the light from the darkness. God named the light day, and the darkness night. So here, in the first chapter of Genesis, we see the creation of earth. God is taking nothing, and He is making something. And over the period of 7 days, God creates everything. And after each day, He says, "It is good." Now we get into a lot of debate in the world about how God created the earth. Okay? A lot of debate. Ask someone and they'll have an opinion. Is Genesis 1 literal? Did God literally create the world in 7 days and then rest and move on? Is it metaphorical? Are those 7 days just eons of time that passed as a God started things in motion and let them happen? Is the Bible a science book? Is a science book the Bible? We debate a lot. And I'm sure each of us have our own personal beliefs. I don't think it matters. And I don't pretend to have the answer. I have my beliefs and I have my leanings, but I think in the end, whether God created it in a literal 7 days or God is the prime mover who starts science in motion, it doesn't really matter. Because what we find in Genesis 1 is the story of a God who, regardless of means, created you, and created me, and created everything that exists, and declared that it was good. So we're not going to spend a huge chunk of time talking about how God created the earth. What we're called to understand in Genesis is that God did create you and me and everything that it is. And as He created it, He declared it is good. So we find a lot of things in Genesis, that first chapter. We find God is the creator. We find God creates what is good. And so, this is the story of God's perfect creation. When things start, it is perfect. Things live in harmony. Things are good. And God creates humanity to watch over this on His behalf. And God offers humanity the opportunity to rule over all these things that He has created, and to do so under His law. But very quickly, God gives humanity a choice. He offers them a moral conundrum. And we find that a little bit in Genesis 2. If you want to open up, we'll be looking there. Specifically verses 16 and 17. So God creates everything, and He creates humanity, and He sends them to what the Bible calls the Garden of Eden. Again, we don't know where on the map the Garden of Eden existed, if it did exist. That doesn't matter. What matters is the story that we're being told. And so God puts Adam and Eve, Adam meaning humanity in ancient Hebrew, and Eve meaning life. So God puts humanity and life into the world. He says, rule over this in relationship with me, trust in me, follow my path, and I will give you everything that you need. You can eat from all the trees. You can use all the animals as you need to. You can live in this perfect world. There's just one thing you can't do. Humanity and life. One tree you can't eat from, and that's the tree of knowledge. Okay? And so God is creating a path. And as He creates, God is in absolute control of the path. And then He offers this fork in the road. And the fork in the road is that tree of knowledge. Okay, so what is God challenging Adam and Eve to? Right? To obey or to disobey? God has said, if you trust in me and you decide that you don't need all the knowledge of the universe because you believe in me and believe and have faith in me that I will guide you in the wrong way, and you obey my command to leave this fruit that gives you all the knowledge in the universe, then you can come on my path and we can rule this world together. Right? If you can get over your own desires and your own needs, then I know that you can obey me and we can live in this reality. On the other hand, is Adam and Eve putting their own preferences, their own needs, and their own desires above the will and the design of God? It's the first time that anything is given free will. The first time that God chooses to listen to the decisions of humanity. And of course, the story tells us that Adam and Eve eat the apple. Right? Genesis 2, 16 through 17. Somewhere in here. The Lord God commanded the human, eat your fill from all of the garden's tree, but don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because on the day you eat from it, you will die. Then the Lord God said, it's not good that human is alone. I will make him a helper that is perfect for him. He creates Eve. And we see later in the chapter that they give in to this little voice that is talking to them. It's depicted in Genesis as the snake, the serpent that comes and talks to Adam and Eve. And the snake keeps saying, disobey. Disobey. Eat that apple. God told you you can't because He's trying to hide something from you. So eat it. Eat it. Eat it. That snake is sin. That snake is us giving in to our own desires and our own needs. And it's innate within us, but something that can be overcome. But not by Adam and Eve in that moment. So they eat the fruit of the tree. They choose to disobey God, and it starts them on this path. So Genesis 1 and 2, in this kind of early beginning story, it tells the story of this God who has created something that he loves and something that is beautiful. And then he gave humanity this choice between obeying him or disobeying him. And they chose to disobey him. Oftentimes we continue to choose to disobey him. Not always as big as eating the tree from the tree of knowledge and of evil, but it's the little places where there is that break in our path where we can choose to obey God or disobey God. And Genesis, that primeval history, shows us the origin of that. So, the first section of Genesis is all about God's creation, how it is good, and then how it spirals badly out of control. So it starts out of the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve eat of the apple. Humanity continues to populate. God doesn't just cancel the project right then and there. He has a little hope, and he tells Adam and Eve, okay, we got to do better this time, all right? Let's get over this. So humanity spreads, humanity populates, and it is just this continual spiral down and down and down and down and down as humanity creates civilizations and societies that are full of sin and evil and who have turned their back on God. They go so far as to create different gods and worship different things, and they ignore God, and so God gets tired of it. God decides that this whole thing, this humanity creation, has gone horribly awry, and we even see in the Scripture that God says, I wish I'd never done it. He's not angry as much as he is disappointed. Right? You hear a parent say, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. Right? That's God, as the Father of this creation, disappointed in the fact that what he has created has turned their back on him. And so in Genesis 6, we start to see that this fracture between God and his final creation comes to a head. And in 6:6, the Lord was sorry he had ever made them and put them on earth. It broke his heart. So God is broken by the sinfulness and the desire and the greed of humanity, and he decides to do something about it. And in Genesis 6:17, we get an idea of what that is. It's the famous story of the flood. God looks out on creation and says, there's just no saving it at this point. And so he picks the most righteous among the people left, this man named Noah and Noah's family, and he says to Noah, we're going to wipe the slate clean. I'm going to reboot it all, and you're going to be who we start with again. Okay? So I'm going to do it by flooding, and you're going to build an ark, and you're going to get your family on it and the animals on it, and we're going to try this all again. And in 6:17 he says, I am now bringing the floodwaters over the earth to destroy everything under the sky that breathes. Everything on earth is about to take its last breath. But I will set up my covenant with you, Noah. You will go into the ark together with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. From all living things, from all creatures, you are to bring a pair, male and female, into the ark with you to keep them alive. From each kind of bird, from each kind of livestock, and from each kind of everything that crawls on the ground, a pair from each will go in with you to stay alive. Take some from every kind of food and stow it in as food for you and for the animals. And Noah did everything exactly as God commanded him. Now again, Genesis is a place where a lot of people find a lot of debates. Did Noah literally build an ark that held a pair of every single animal on earth? Probably not, but I don't know. Maybe he had some really creative use of closet space. I don't know. Carl.
I want to emphasize this. In Chinese history, 4,000 years ago, sea levels were 100 meters higher than today. That's 324 feet. All of Florida would have been flooded. All of sea level, Atlanta would be, the Atlantic Sea would be at Atlanta, Georgia, and that type of thing.
Yeah.
And we know that was a fact.
Sure. And historically, this type of flood story is not unique to Christianity. Many faiths have this story of human beings disobeying the gods that created them and the gods wiping the slate clean. And again, we can argue, was it a big flood or did a sea break open and flood this one area where kind of humanity thought that it existed? Remember, the world is small. So people in the Middle East experiencing these Jewish traditions don't know that China exists or that there are people there, don't know that South America exists and there are communities developing there. So the world is very small for folks. They're isolated in their own communities. So when the world floods, is it just a small area? Well, it could be. Was their definition of every animal different because of that small geographic location? It certainly could be. Could it just be a story? Well, sure. And again, I contend that it doesn't really matter. Because what we see here is a God who is heartbroken. A God who created you and created me and created all that was, and sees that creation turning its back on God, living in sin and ignoring what he has told them. And not a God who is angry. A lot of people think that the flood happened because God is mad and he's spiteful and he wants revenge against people. This is a God who's so desperate to make this right and to love his creation that he wants to try again. He wants this fresh start. He wants this clean slate. And so he's saying, okay, one more time. Let's go for it. And so he picks this family, and the story is told, and they survive the flood. God starts over, and again, we screw it up. Noah is the best among the people left on earth, and after he gets off of the ark, what's he do? He builds a vineyard, and he gets drunk. He has a strange episode with his son in the tent, and sin starts again. His children start to sin, his family starts to sin, and humanity continues this spiral down. Right? So if there was a chance that we could break off of the spiral with the flood, well, it didn't work. It just moved the spiral over, and it continues down. Right? So after the flood, God again lets humanity develop, and it continues to sin, and it continues to get worse. And this culminates in the story of the Tower of Babel. This is towards the end of Genesis. And again, we're skipping a lot here because we're trying to get through 5 books of the Bible in 1 hour. Okay? So we're jumping around. But so Noah and his family almost immediately break this covenant with God. Remember what he says here in Genesis 6. He says, I'm building a new covenant, a new contract with you. To do it right, and immediately the inner desire to place their own needs over the desires of God, protect their tribe over everyone else, kicks in, and sin finds its way back into the world. And so then, we see the world start to recreate, societies are created again, and humanity starts to get tricky. And in Genesis 13, we start to see the story of the Tower of Babel. Verses 15 and 16. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. Sorry. Genesis 11, 1 through 10. Let's try there. All people on earth had one language and the same words. When they traveled east, they found a valley in the land of Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them hard. They used bricks for stones and asphalt for mortar. They said, come, let's build for ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the sky, and let's make a name for ourselves, so that we won't be dispersed over all the earth. So humanity has gotten together, and they're kind of located in this one area, as the story tells us. And God looks at this and knows that as much sin as there is in the world, this place is just going to be awful. And then he sees that people are devising a way to place themselves above him, to make a name for themselves over God, and build this tower that challenges the sky and challenges God. And again, God finds himself going, man, when are we going to get this right? And so he looks at the city of Babel, and he decides that he's going to disperse the nations. He's going to spread the people out, give them new and different languages, and once more, he's going to try to do this all again. So he takes Babel, and he separates it, and out of Babel, the city that tried to build the tower that challenged God, God picks one man, Abraham, says, I'm going to start it again with you. Started with Adam and Eve, and it didn't work. I tried it again with Noah, and it didn't work. This time, you and your descendants will build my kingdom on earth, Abraham. You will be known as Israel. So he pulls Abraham out of all this sin, and he promises him a holy land. And this is where the two stories link. Abraham. The primeval and the ancestral stories link right here. The primeval, chapters 1 through 11, tell the story of God's beautiful creation, that he made perfect and that he loved, and that he hoped humanity would live in harmony with him and with his creation. And the spiral out of control as darkness and greed and human depravity takes over. And so then this link is not God abandoning everyone, but it's God's final backup plan. It's God's redemptive work to make things right. And so we find in Genesis 13, verses 15 through 16, and I know I'm right this time, the promise that God makes to Abraham. After Lot separated from him, the Lord said to Abraham, from the place where you are standing, look up and gaze to the north, south, east, and west. Because all the land that you see, I give you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth, If someone could count the bits of dust on the earth, well, then they could also count your descendants. Stand up and walk around through the length and breadth of the land, because I am giving it to you." So Abraham packed his tent and went and settled by the oaks of Mamre in Hebron. There he built an altar to the Lord. So God has taken Abraham out of Babel, and he says, "I'm going to make a promise to you. You and your descendants will take over the land. I give to you this holy land, what we now call modern-day Jerusalem. So as far as you can see, north, east, south, and west, that is yours. It is a holy place, this wonderful place. It is where you and your descendants will live under this new covenant." And so God makes promises to Abraham that he will have a family, that family will become God's priesthood, and that family will spread the word of God all over the world. And does Abraham get it perfectly right? Does Abraham do exactly what God asked him to do? Do Abraham and Sarah, his wife, just nail it this time because we finally overcome this spiral out of control and away from God? No, of course not. God promises Abraham that he will have a family, and then Abraham continuously acts like Sarah is not actually his wife, and goes so far as to offer her to other men. And then he's mad that she can't give him a son. Sarah gets tired of waiting to have a son, and so she gives her servant woman to Abraham so that they can have a son together. And the whole time God's going, "I have a plan. Settle down, calm down, wait for it. I know what we're doing here." And Abraham almost immediately starts pushing back. But this time, God knows he's not going to hit the reset button. God's going to continue to keep his promises and continue to work through and in these people and try to bring them back into a more pure relationship with God. So now, we're here. This ancestral story, the story of the very first Israelites, the very first Jewish people. And it starts with Abraham as the head of the tribe of Israel. Not yet a geographic location, but a people, a group of individuals. And so we find that Abraham has two children, one by Sarah and one by Sarah's maid. And so they are Jacob, his child with Sarah, and Esau. Esau gets all of Abraham's inheritance. He's the oldest child, and that law has not changed a whole lot over the eons. And so the oldest child gets everything, but Jacob is Abraham's favorite, right? Because Jacob is the child that he had with Sarah, the woman that he actually loves. And so Abraham prefers Jacob, and Jacob is jealous of what Esau is going to get. So Jacob, who turns out, at least in his adolescence, is not a very good guy, decides to trick his father. His father, at this point, is old, and he's blind, and so Jacob covers himself in her hair, because Esau's a hairy guy and a big guy, and he goes into his father's tent, and he tricks him into giving the inheritance to Jacob instead of Esau. And Esau finds out, and he's not very happy, and Jacob flees with the inheritance of his father to a different land. Esau, as far as the Bible tells us, doesn't have kids. The lineage does not continue down Esau. Where we go in this story is with Jacob. Jacob has 12 children. Big family. But Jacob, too, like his father, picks a favorite. It's not the firstborn, it's not the secondborn. It is his 11th born son, Joseph. So here the story continues. Jacob loves Joseph way more than his other 11 children, and they can see it. Not only in the way he acts, but in the things he gives Joseph, including that now famous Technicolor dream coat. Right? Jacob gets this wonderful and beautiful robe, and he gives it to Joseph to show that you are my favorite. I like you way more than everyone else, and it's okay that they know it, except for Jacob's brothers don't like that. And so we find that Joseph's brothers decide to do something about it. If you turn to Genesis 37, verses 23 through 24, we can find out what they did. And I'm going to actually jump ahead. I'll start at 37:18. They saw Joseph, the brothers, in the distance before he got close to them, and they plotted to kill him. The brothers said to each other, "Here comes the big dreamer. Come on now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the cisterns, and we'll say a wild animal devoured him. Then we will see what becomes of his dreams." When Reuben, one of the brothers, heard what they said, he saved him from them, telling them, "Let's not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Don't spill his blood. Throw him into this desert cistern, but don't lay a hand on him." He intended to save Joseph and then take him back to the father. When Joseph reached his brothers, they stripped off Joseph's long robe, the technicolor dream coat, took him and threw him into the cistern, an empty cistern with no water in it. When they sat down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with camels carrying sweet resin, medicinal resin, and fragrant resin on their way down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What do we gain if we kill our brother and hide his blood? Come on, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let's not harm him because he's our brother, he's family." His brothers agreed, and when some midnight traders passed by, they pulled Joseph up out of the cistern. They sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph to Egypt. Okay, so being the favorite child is not always a good thing. If you have 11 brothers who really don't like you, they can choose not to kill you, but to sell you into slavery. And so Joseph, now the main character of this story, finds himself in Egypt. Now, when Joseph gets to Egypt, he is bought by a very important political person. Not the king, but someone closely connected to the king. And that's where different translations will use a different title for that person. But we know that Joseph is bought by an advisor to the king in Egypt. And Joseph does good work for this advisor, and he prospers, he becomes important, but then he doesn't. He falls from grace and he ends up in prison. And so now he's in prison, and Joseph does some more things. Because Joseph has been blessed by the Lord. And God has decided that Joseph, as the favorite son of Jacob, is going to carry this tradition, this Israelite tribe through. And so he blesses everything that Joseph does. So when he's in the service of the king's advisor, Egypt, and the people who listen to Joseph prosper. And when he's in prison, he continues to prosper. Joseph starts to interpret dreams, he starts to change lives, and the Pharaoh finds out how good Joseph is, and that when Joseph says something, it usually works out, and the Pharaoh decides to make Joseph a governor of Egypt. Joseph, through these weird turns of events, becomes the second in command of all of Egypt. He's the right hand of the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And so, because he's blessed, Joseph decides to do lots of things. He's mostly in charge of the agriculture, the story tells us. And so Joseph sees that Egypt has had lots of great crop years. They've been making a lot of crops, and so the option is, do we sell it all and make huge profits, or do we start to stockpile it in case things go wrong somewhere down the line? And Joseph stockpiles the crops of Egypt. He puts all the grain inside of these bins and keeps it just in case a rainy day comes. And of course, a rainy day comes. While Joseph is the governor, the second in command, the entire Middle East is hit by a huge drought. The crops dry up, food becomes scarce, but Egypt, because of the leadership of Joseph, has all this extra food laying around. They're ready for it, so they continue to prosper and to grow and to survive through this drought because of Joseph. So lo and behold, who comes looking for food because of this drought? We find the answer in Genesis 42, verse 6. And I'm actually going to start at the very beginning of 42 because it gives us a little more context. When Jacob, Joseph's father, learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you staring blankly at each other? I've just heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us that we can survive and not starve to death." So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. However, Jacob didn't send Joseph's brother Benjamin along with his brothers because he thought something bad might happen to him. And I'd be a little wary if one of the brothers got kicked out by all the other brothers too. So Joseph keeps one, or Jacob keeps one with him. Israel's sons came to buy grain with others, who also came since the famine had spread to the land of Canaan. As for Joseph, he was the land's governor, and he was the one selling grain to all the land's people. When Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him, their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he acted like he didn't know them. He spoke to them with a harsh tone and said, "Where have you come from?" So the brothers don't recognize Joseph, and why would they? Your assumption after you sell your brother into slavery is not that he will become the second in command in Egypt and be in charge of your fate. So they're not looking at him thinking, hey, you look familiar. They're bowing down to this man who holds their faith. And at first, Joseph's maybe a little angry. And he scorns his brothers a little bit and decides to test them to see whether or not they feel bad that they might have killed their brother by selling him into slavery. And so he asks them, and they lament how bad they feel about what they did to Joseph. And Joseph's heart is warmed, and he forgives them, and he tells them to go back and to get their father, to bring him to Egypt so that they can live with each other, live in this land that has food, and he saves them from this famine. So Joseph, who ends up in who ends up in Egypt because his brothers abandon him and turn on him and sell him into slavery, ends up saving the Israelites. Jacob and the Israelite tribe moves to Egypt. They live with Joseph. And towards the end of Genesis, Joseph says something that sums up the entire book. Turn to Genesis 50, verse 20. He's sitting, having a meal with his brothers, and he says to them, "You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it, in order to save the lives of many people, just as he's doing today. You planned something bad for me, but God produced something good from it." Joseph has summarized this story that humanity is on. It starts with this creation. It is good and it is beautiful and God loves it, but we turn our backs on it. Humanity abandons that plan, chooses their own desire, their own will, and falls. And then God decides, the only way I can make this work is to create a new promise, a new covenant with these people connected to Abraham, the Israelites. And so he takes what we do bad and tries his hardest to make something good from it. And that's encapsulated in this story of Joseph. His brothers try to sell him into slavery. They succeed. And they think that he's gone and he'll never do anything. But God takes that story, turns him into a powerful man who saves the lives of thousands of people because of his decision to stockpile the food and prepare Egypt for famine. They planned something bad for him, but God turned it into something and saved lives in doing so. So, we've come through the book of Genesis and it only took 35 minutes. Skipped quite a lot, but those are the nitty-gritty details that tell this story and anchor the creation to our current existence. Right? God creates something that is beautiful. Humanity chooses themselves over it. And God decides, I'm not going to give up. I'll try something else. I'll build this new covenant. And even when you abandon the promises I've made to you, I'm going to keep coming back. When you do something bad, I'll make something good out of it. Okay? Any questions about Genesis before we move on? Yeah.
Just that you left out Isaac and Ishmael. They were the sons of Abraham. And
Right.
then Jacob was the son of Isaac.
Yes, you are right. Yeah, I skipped a generation in my genealogy. You are correct. Yeah. So, listen to her. And we skipped a lot. I mean, if you choose to go and read Genesis straight through, you're going to find a lot of pretty good stories that I left out because they're like the little sides to this overarching story. We just don't have time, as much as I'd like to dig into all that. So we're going to keep talking about Genesis because it's the beginning of this long story of this relationship between us and humanity and God. And it kicks it off, and it's an important aspect of it. But we're going to move now to the book of Exodus. Now, the Bible tries, but doesn't really nail the transition between Genesis and Exodus. So at the end of Genesis, all the Israelites are in Egypt. And that's fine, because Joseph's the second in charge. He's got the ear of the Pharaoh. He can protect his tribe of people. So it's okay that they live there. But then politics happened, and a new king rises to power. We're told in Exodus 1. And that new king, he decides that there are too many of the Israelites to trust anymore. The new king says that there's thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of them. They outnumber Egyptians. We'd be foolish to let them stay in power because they could rule over us. So he says to the Egyptians, we will make them slaves. And so the Pharaoh enslaves the people of Israel. Pharaoh, Egyptian word for king, decides that these Israelites, they're too dangerous. We've got to do something about them. We'd be fools not to act. And so he makes them slaves. And he puts them in bondage, and he works them hard. Okay? The Pharaoh, he takes away their human rights. He takes away everything about them that makes them human beings. He uses them to build the great monuments of Egypt. Aliens didn't build the pyramids. Tens of thousands of slave laborers built the pyramids because when they're slaves, in Pharaoh's eyes, you don't care if a huge rock crushes their head and they die. They're just going to build that pyramid, that tomb, that big monument to me. So the Pharaoh enslaves the Israelites. And we can see that at the very beginning of Exodus. I mean, in that very first verse. Actually, in chapter 1, verse 8. Now a new king came to power in Egypt who didn't know Joseph. He said to his people, "The Israelite people are now larger in number and stronger than we are. Come on, let's be smart and deal with them. Otherwise, they will only grow in number. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and then escape from this land." And so as a result, the Egyptians put foremen of forced work gangs over the Israelites to harass them with hard work. They had to build storage cities named Pithom and Ramses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they grew and spread, so much so that the Egyptians started to look at the Israelites with disgust and dread. Pretty quickly, the Egyptians forget that an Israelite man saved them from famine, and they turn these people into a slave population. And it's a cruel slavery. In Exodus 1:22, we find that it says, "Then Pharaoh gave an order to all his people, throw every baby boy born to the Hebrews into the Nile River, but you can let all the girls live." So Pharaoh wants to break the back of the Israelites. He wants to crush the Israelites, and he declares, you know what, let's get on top of this, throw all their baby boys into the river. And they're not going to swim, they're going to drown or be eaten by a crocodile or crushed by a huge animal, and he knows that. And so in Exodus 2, we see the birth story of this man named Moses. A Levite woman becomes pregnant. The Levites are one of the tribes of Israel. There's 12 different tribes of Israel. So this Levite woman becomes pregnant, and she has a boy, and she knows that the order is to throw this boy into the river. And if she doesn't do it, an Egyptian foreman will come and do it for her. So she decides to put this baby boy into the river, but she puts a reed basket in first and places the baby in it. And that reed basket drifts down the river and is picked up by the daughter of the Pharaoh. Instead of killing, Moses decides to raise Moses. She names him Moses, raises him in the household of the Pharaoh. He's like the Pharaoh's step-grandson. He's beloved and cared for, and he makes a great Disney movie. Moses is privileged. He's been brought into the household of power, and he's at the center of all of it. And he grows up in that, and he's just fine with that. But one day, as an adult, we're told he walks out and he sees the oppression being done to the Israelites. Exodus 2, 1 through 10 tells his story, and you can see at the end, verse 11, that one day after Moses had become an adult, he went out among his people, and he saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. He looked around to make sure no one else was there. Then he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So Moses, who's been raised in privilege, has the ability to see that these Egyptian rulers are treating his people badly. And he watches as an Egyptian foreman beats an Israelite, and he just can't handle it anymore, and he kills that Egyptian. And immediately Moses goes, oh no, what have I done? And so Moses tries to hide, and the next day he goes out and he asks a question of Hebrews, and they say, who put you in charge? You're going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? And Moses realizes that people know, and that he's in danger. And now the Pharaoh knows, and the Pharaoh wants Moses dead. So Moses runs away from Egypt. He tries to get out on his own, and he ends up in this region, Midian, which is probably right there. So he leaves Egypt and he flees to Midian, and he starts a new life for himself. He becomes a shepherd. He finds a woman he loves. He develops this whole new life. But then he has this experience with God. He finds God in a burning bush. Well, at least a bush that is on fire but isn't really burning up. Moses walks to the bush and God speaks to him. And we can find that in Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 4. When the Lord saw that he was coming to look, God called to him out of the bush. "Moses, Moses." And Moses said, "I'm here." Then the Lord said, "Don't come any closer. Take off your sandals because you are standing on holy ground." He continued, "I am the God of your father, Abraham's God, Isaac's God, and Jacob's God." Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. So God starts this conversation, and he explains to Moses, "I have seen that my people are oppressed in Egypt, and I want to help them, and you are going to help me do that." And he tells Moses to go back to Egypt, to use the tools and the powers I'm going to give you, and free the Israelites. And God says, "Go and talk to the Pharaoh and tell him that the Lord has told him to release the Israelites." And I'm guessing that pretty quickly Moses is skeptical that that idea is going to work. But after some convincing, he decides to go. And we pick up the story again in Exodus 5, the very first verse. "Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, 'This is what the Lord, Israel's God, says. Let my people go so that they can hold a festival for me in the desert.' But Pharaoh said, 'Who is this Lord whom I am supposed to obey by letting Israel go? I don't know this Lord, and I certainly won't let Israel go.' So Moses goes to Pharaoh, he obeys God, and he says, 'Hey Pharaoh, our God, Yahweh, the Lord, wants you to let us all go, that way we can worship him out in the desert.' And the Pharaoh, who believes he himself is a god, right? Ancient Egyptian kings believed that they were gods, and Egyptians believed in many gods, and he's never heard of this Yahweh, this Lord that the Israelites proclaim. And so Pharaoh says, 'Forget you. I don't care about that God. He's not my God. He's not me. No one can command me to do anything. Get out of here. I'm keeping your people.' And in fact, Pharaoh is insulted by this request by Moses and decides to work the slaves harder. He tells the foreman, 'We used to bring the straw that they used to make bricks to them. We're not going to do that anymore. You make them walk and get the straw and bring it to the brick foundry and make it themselves. Beat them harder, work them harder, make their life hard, because this Moses guy, whoever he thinks he is, came and told me what to do because of his Lord.' So Pharaoh's mad. Then Moses goes to God and says, 'I tried, and it didn't work. Pharaoh's not going to budge. He wants to keep the Israelites.' And God says, 'Okay, we'll try this another way.' And this is one of the famous parts of the book of Exodus, when God brings a series of plagues upon the people of Egypt. God knows that the Pharaoh is not going to give in easily. God knows that he's going to have to work hard, and so he brings these plagues. First, God turns water to blood. Then he brings an invasion of frogs and swarming lice and insects. He makes the animals sick, many of whom die. Skin sores and blisters cover Egyptians, and God brings down hail and thunder and mighty storms. Locusts come and eat the crops, and through the acts of Moses, God even covers Egypt in darkness for 3 whole days, the story tells us. The story also tells us that the advisors of the Pharaoh are saying, apparently this Israelite Lord has some power. You've made him mad. Terrible things are happening. Just let them go. People are dying. People are hurting. The people are okay with it. Let them go. Let's get past this. But Pharaoh is stubborn. Pharaoh is evil. And his heart hardens and he says, "No, I'm not letting the Israelites go. This God of theirs can do whatever he needs to. I'm keeping them." And so finally, God brings a final disaster to Egypt. Exodus 11:4 is the next place we'll turn to. The Lord said to Moses, "I'll bring one more disaster on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he'll let you go from here. In fact, when he lets you go, he'll eagerly chase you out of here. Tell every man to ask his neighbor and every woman to ask her neighbor for all their silver and gold jewelry." The Lord made sure the Egyptians were kind to the Hebrew people. In addition, Pharaoh's officials and the Egyptian people even came to honor Moses as a great and important man in the land. And so Moses said, "This is what the Lord says. At midnight I'll go throughout Egypt. Every oldest child in the land of Egypt will die, from the oldest child of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the oldest child of the servant woman by the millstones, and all the first offspring of the animals. Then a terrible cry of agony will echo through the whole land of Egypt, unlike any heard before, or that ever will be again." So God says, "Okay, I've tried to act nicely. I've tried to show you that I want my people freed. And I saw what you did, Pharaoh. I watched as you threw every boy of the Israelites into a river. And so here's a little tit for tat." It's not revenge, it's God recognizing the evil that is in Pharaoh, realizing that he has to get his people out, these people he loves. and is going to go to that length to do it. But he doesn't want everyone to die. And so God tells Moses, tell the Israelites that they need to find a lamb. And the verses and chapters that come after this are basically a recipe book for a dinner party. God says, go and find a lamb, and here's how you're going to prepare it, and here's how you're going to cook it, and here's how you're going to eat it. But the important thing is that you take the blood of this lamb, and you spread it around the door of your house. Cover your door in blood. That way when I come through, if I see the blood, I'll know that that is where an Israelite is. That's where a blessed person lives, and I will pass over that house. God allows the Israelites to sacrifice something in exchange for themselves. A sacrificial offering to God that absolves them of their sins and lets him pass over. The Passover feast that later Jesus will celebrate with his disciples in the upper room, that we as Christians call the Last Supper, finds its origins here. On this night, the Israelites gather together and they feast and they celebrate and glorify God, and he passes over his chosen people. And of course, after the death hits Egypt, Pharaoh is angry, he's hurt, and he says, go, get out. And the Egyptian people certainly say, go, get out, we've had enough. And the Egyptians, the story says, are nice and say, just please leave, take what you need and go, we're done with you. But then Pharaoh's heart is hardened once more. And in Exodus 14:5, we can see that. When Egypt's king was told that the people had run away, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about the people. They said, what have we done, letting Israel go free from their slavery to us? So he sent for his chariot and took his army with him. He took 600 elite chariots and all of Egypt's other chariots with captains on all of them. The Lord made Pharaoh, Egypt's king, stubborn, and he chased the Israelites who were leaving confidently. So, Pharaoh kind of has this second thinking, and he says, you know what, no. I'm not letting the Israelites go. Get my chariot, get your chariots, we're chasing after them. And then there's this somewhat strange line. It says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart so that he would chase the Israelites. And the question is, why would God harden his heart so that he will chase the Israelites? What's all that about? God has seen the evil inside of Pharaoh. And he's been proved to that there's nothing he can do to make that evil go away. He's tried to convince Pharaoh to change his ways. He has brought literally hell and damnation down on the Pharaoh, and nothing has worked. And so God is going to use Pharaoh's evil to trap himself. Right? Pharaoh's greed, Pharaoh's anger, Pharaoh's evil will be his own demise. And so God lets his heart harden. God doesn't try to stop or intervene, for Pharaoh has shown who he truly is at his deepest level. And so Pharaoh chases the Israelites, and Moses and the Israelites quickly grow scared of what could happen. And you would be too if there were hundreds of chariots chasing after you, the best men in the Egyptian army trying to get you to turn around. Yet Moses tells the people, take it easy. We're going to be okay. We're going to get through this. And so as they reach what the story tells us is now the Red Sea, or somewhere maybe up in this cropping here, their backs are against the water, and Moses turns to the Israelites and he says, it's okay, at some point God is going to intervene, and the chariots are barreling down towards them, and God says to Moses, turn around and lift your rod, and he parts the sea. And the Israelites are allowed to pass right over dry land through the sea, and the chariots of the Pharaoh chase them directly in. So the Israelites get out and pass the sea, and they set up camp, and the Pharaoh's people set up camp in this path that God has created through the sea. Yeah.
Well, some archaeologists have found that there was a land bridge across the Red Sea, and we don't know just where it was. And there were two large columns, some 30 feet high and maybe 12 or 15 feet in diameter. And you could walk, you can't see the land, but you walk from one pillar to the other one on the other side. And so the Israelites walked on that, and it was like 18 inches or 2 feet deep or something like that. And so they had several days in which to walk. When they all got over, they tore down the pillar, the marker on the Sinai side. And so then the Egyptians tried to come and follow that, and they got lost and would drown. and they found some old Roman chariots in that area where that land bridge had existed.
Yeah, several archaeologists have theorized that that is what happened. It's another one of those situations where it's possible. No one knows for sure. Like I said, historical record doesn't indicate that that's what happened. And some archaeologists would push that Egyptians at this point in time would not have had Roman chariots, or Rome did not exist in that way yet. And again, it's one of those sections where we can spend a lot of time parsing out what could have happened, what might have happened, what did happen. But here again, we find this story of the God as the creator of the Israelites, the creator of you and me, who chooses to intervene and save the people who obey him. Right? Humanity is all given this chance on the path, right? And it breaks, and there's the chance to obey or disobey. And the Israelites, under the guidance of Moses, have chosen to obey. The Egyptians, who were talked to by God, choose to disobey, and God works with those who obey, punish those who didn't. So, how did it happen? We will probably never know with 100% certainty. But this story of a God who loves his creation and sacrifices for his creation and saves his creation is what matters. And so God says to Moses, turn around, lift your staff. They walk through, and the next day as the Egyptian army prepares to make their final run and overrun and kill the Israelites, the story tells us that the seas close, the chariots caught up with it, and there are no remains. It's all gone. And so Moses and the Israelites are out of Egypt. They're free now, allowed to live their own life. And so they travel on what is now called the Sinai Peninsula, and they find a mountain. They travel for months, and they start to get angry at Moses. Immediately things start to go wrong. They've created this new covenant. They've seen a miracle of God, and then they start to doubt. They're a little hungry, and the tents aren't very comfortable, and they're not sure where they're going. And even Moses' brother and sister start to talk bad behind his back. Then they find their way to Mount Sinai, and that's where the middle part of this story takes place. Again, some archaeologists think they found the Mount Sinai, but there's another camp of archaeologists who say, no, we haven't. We don't know which one is which, and it doesn't matter where the real Mount Sinai is. The stories that happen there are what matters. But we are out of time. We did not get through 5 books of the Bible tonight, and we're going to have to figure out how we can power through all of this over the next 7 weeks.
You're going to have to talk faster.
I am. I'm going to have to go double time. I was a little worried when I got started tonight that I wasn't going to make it, and you know what? I didn't. So, we'll pick up next week in the middle of the story of Exodus. And we're going to spend a lot of time in Genesis and Exodus because they tell this really critical beginning story. There are some pieces of the Bible that we'll go through quickly, not because they don't matter, but because in the overarching story they are smaller pieces. Okay? So we'll pick it up next week in the middle of Exodus.